Welcome to the U.S. midterm election panel, and the attendance here suggests that there's a real appetite to know what just happened last night. So I'm sure that you'll be further enlightened at the end of this session. We have an amazing panel. And the way we want to work is we want, after the panelists, to make some introductory comments, to open the floor up to you about anything related to last night's election. So this panel is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Democracy and Diversity and the Department of Political Studies here at Queen's. My name is Jonathan Rose, and before we begin, I wanted to recognize that we are situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. And when we're talking about seats and territory and land, it's really important to reflect that these lands in Canada, and certainly in the United States, were occupied long before the people who are sitting in the legislatures were there. So as of today, we have, as you know, a dead heat in the Senate, and my phone just buzzed saying Georgia will be a runoff in December. So things are changing very quickly. And what I'm hoping and what I think this panel will provide great expertise on is not specifically the minutiae of what happened last night, but to try to put it in a broader context. All four are eminent scholars in their respective fields, so let me just quickly introduce them to you and then turn it over to them. So on your far left is P.J. Gardner, and Paul is an assistant professor of political studies here in the department. On the right, sorry, thank you. My left. Political studies at Queen's. He was formerly a visiting researcher at the Center for Law and Contemporary Workplace at the Faculty of Law here, and a postdoctoral fellow at the Maxwell School in Syracuse. PJ received his doctorate from Princeton University and teaches in the department in the areas of law and politics, American institutions, judicial politics, American political development, law, and society. Beside PJ is Elizabeth Goodyear-Grant, and for those Politics 110 students, you'll have the pleasure and honor of having Professor Grant as your instructor next term. Professor Grant is professor in the Department of Political Studies and director of the Canadian Opinion Research Archive. Her research focuses on Canadian politics, with particular interest in electoral politics, voting behavior, public opinion, news media, and representation of women. Professor Goodyear-Grant's book, called Gendered News, Media Coverage in Electoral Politics in Canada, was incredibly well received, winning the 2016 Pierre Savard Award from the International Council of Canadian Studies, and was one of 3 shortlisted books for the country's largest prize, the Donald Smiley Prize by the Canadian Political Science Association. Beside Professor Goodyear-Grant is Carmen Celestini, and Carmen Celestini is currently a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Religion, and she studies far-right movements in Canada, their formation, appeal, financing, and she is a lecturer at the University of Waterloo. Dr. Celestini's work is on conspiracy theories, disinformation, and right-wing extremism. She's completed a postdoctoral fellowship on the Center, with the Center of Hate, Bias, and Extremism, and she's done lots of public engagement through CNN, PBS, Global News, and the New York Times. And finally, beside Carmen is Joel Sokolosky. Professor Sokolosky is Principal Emeritus at Royal Military College across the causeway there. He's cross-appointed to the Department of Political Studies here at Queen's. He has taught at Johns Hopkins, Dalhousie, and Duke University. He's been the visiting Canada-US Fulbright Scholar and has served as consultant for several government offices, including the Associate Deputy Minister of National Defense and the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. And Professor Sokolosky is an expert on international relations, so we'll bring that perspective. So I'll turn it over to the panel, at which time I will open the floor. So let's start with you, Professor Gardner.
Thank you. So normally I would resist applying sort of game frames to politics, but One thing that I noticed last night is that it seems as though this election is resisting sort of having a narrative applied to it. And so with that in mind, I'm going to name what I think are a few winners and a few losers from the election. And some of them I'll sort of leave as teasers. Perhaps we can talk about them in Q&A, and I'll go into detail about some of the other ones here in my opening comments. So last night it seems clear, right, that the Democrats had a relatively good night based or compared to some expectations. Looks like they may lose the House, but may hold on to the Senate. In general, a red wave failed to materialize, so we can say some things about that, certainly. It looks like traditional legacy polling outlets had a pretty good night last night. Pollsters like the New York Times, like Marist, some of the more traditional outlets seem to have a better time predicting the race than some of the others. And another sort of, this would be a concept that had a good night last night, is election integrity. So election deniers appear to have largely lost in the places that it mattered. So in a lot of places where election deniers were running on a platform of changing elections, undermining the way that elections were counted, a lot of those candidates lost. Tudor Dixon in Michigan, Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania were essentially election conspiracy theorists who promised to make changes that would deliver more votes to Republicans. Carrie Lake has especially leaned into election denial, and her candidacy has really become associated with that. And it looks like all of those candidates are going to lose. Of course, Carrie Lake's is still very much up in the air, but it's not looking promising based on the early returns for her. Democratic wins in some of these key swing states mean that it's going to be easier for them to try to preserve some of the quality of the elections. Tony Evers in Wisconsin is the incumbent who was reelected, has already vetoed more than a dozen bills that would sort of serve to undermine the counting of votes and give political officials more power to overturn the results of the elections that the voters made decisions in. This was also true in a number of Secretary of State races in Minnesota and Michigan, where again, election deniers appear to have lost. Right, so I think that's a major sort of thing that we can point to that's going to have big effects as we look forward to future elections and in 2024, where there are candidates who have promised that they will not accept the results of these elections. Speaking of such candidates, right, a loser last night seems to have been Donald Trump. We can talk about his endorsed candidates and sort of whether there was any value to the endorsements that he gave, and whether there is evidence that candidates that he was not endorsing did quite a bit better. Democrats seem to have a Florida problem. So Democrats in Florida seem to resist the general sort of idea that Democrats had a good night last night. There may be some interesting reasons for that. And I said traditional polling outlets had a good night last night, but partisan pollsters and some naive poll aggregation websites have had a really bad night last night. There are some pretty interesting reasons for that, I think. I think what's going on in these cases is that we all know that polling in elections has had some difficult times recently. Failing to predict outcomes in 2016 and being off in significant states in 2020. And quality polling outlets have been grappling with that in significant ways, trying to figure out how to resolve these sorts of issues, looking deep into the methodology, trying to figure out what's going on. But a number of other outlets have tried to resolve that question and sort of get in underneath the radar by simply putting partisan weights on their polls, right? Rather than trying to figure out what's actually going on underneath these polls that's leading to the wrong results, they're just putting the thumb on the scales. And while that works sometimes, right, and it worked pretty well in 2020 for pollsters like the Trafalgar Group, it really can backfire in a night last night where it seems like good polling methods actually led to the correct result, leading groups like Trafalgar Group and pollster aggregation websites like Real Clear Politics to do fairly badly because they naively sort of take polls from some of these partisan firms and don't sort of figure out what's going on underneath the hood. Some groups like 538 did a little bit better, but it's worth thinking a little bit about the quality of some of this polling, and those polling firms did have a bad night.
Great, thank you. I'm happy to say some of my points actually are like really complementary to yours. I guess there's sort of two big things that I wanted to sort of lead with. And one is this talk about winners and losers, or sort of like a strategic lens on the election outcomes. If we look back at the political science research and at historical data, we see that historically, president's parties lose seats in midterms, and the historic average is 28 seats in the House and 6 in the Senate. And, you know, Republicans especially, but a lot of media were talking about this as a sort of ballpark, if not more. The numbers actually, for the House, especially, almost double historically in terms of seat losses, around 45 or so, if the president's approval rating is below 50%, which Biden's has been for most of his first 2 years in office. So expectations for Democrat performance were pretty low, and for Republican performance, quite high. And so, I mean, interestingly, despite the fact that the Democrats are obviously losing seats, especially in the House, the small number of seats that at least it's sort of clear they're losing right now is, I mean, I can't emphasize enough how surprisingly low it is. So despite the fact that the Democrats aren't netting seats, I mean, I don't know that I would portray it as a victory, but this is a very optimistic moment for the Biden Democrats. So that's one really big point. Speaking of winners and losers then, I want to sort of piggyback a bit on Paul's discussion of Trump. One of the big things that was quite evident early on yesterday is that where the Republicans sustained losses is disproportionately among Trump-backed Republican candidates. And that's important, I think, for a few reasons. First of all, a path to Donald Trump's nomination for 2024 is much less clear or certain now. He has intimated in the last few days, especially, that he's planning to announce a run for the presidency in the next few weeks. And he very well may do so, and certainly Donald Trump has been down and out before in his life, in politics and in other spheres, and has come back. So like, he's not somebody you would want to discount. But last night was a blow, unequivocally, to the Trump version of Republicanism. How that plays out and what it looks like is unclear. And it's also unclear because some of the clear winners last night look a lot like Trump. So people like Ron DeSantis in Florida, Paul mentioned Florida, and Florida was a sort of interesting case last night because, you know, for the last, I guess, couple of decades, it's been seen as a purple state, a so-called battleground state. Last night was not consistent with that, right? This is last night a solidly red state. And DeSantis is someone who, I mean, I would say is almost certain to throw his hat in the ring for the 2024 Republican nomination. So this also cues up a potentially bloody battle for the Republican nomination in 2024. I mean, not that that didn't exist before last night, but this intensifies it and I think puts more of a spotlight on it. So basically, I guess what I'm driving at is that internal politics in the Republican Party are about to get, I think, much more vicious, much more bloody. And I mean, people who do dislike Trump and the way that the party has gone in recent years, I mean, see this as a positive development, I suppose. One wonders what the sort of outcome will be and where it will drive candidates and the issues in the next presidential election. The other point I wanted to make is about voter behavior. So this is like among my bread and butter topics in political science, and there were some interesting trends that seem to be appearing out of early exit polling. So like, take that with a grain of salt. But one of the big things that I noticed is Gen Zers. Gen Zers turned out in numbers that were unexpected, and they broke overwhelmingly for Democrats. And so one wonders how mobilizing efforts like the, youth mobilization around gun control in the United States as a result of like the Parkland shooting and other issues, how this is playing into this sort of like upswelling of youth voter engagement. And regardless of which party youth end up choosing, I view this as a sort of positive outcome on its own. And then the fact that they're expressing their views and their wishes for the policy agenda of the country in such a way, for me personally, to promote progressive politics and public safety and lots of other things, like I think that's such a positive thing. Among voters too, I guess there's a couple more trends that I would highlight and I just sort of queue up that we can discuss if people are interested in voter behavior. Interestingly, white suburban women swung more towards the Republicans than they had been already. This is a really important segment of the electorate. It's very large, and it's been the sort of mainstay of the Republican Party for a little while now. And another interesting trend that I saw too is that non-Cuban Latino voters went even, like, there was a big gain by the Republicans among this segment of the electorate. And I do want to resist sort of homogenizing Latino voters because there's a lot of important heterogeneity among this segment of the electorate. But, I mean, to connect what I was saying before about some of the winners and losers, like one of the reasons that DeSantis and Rubio and other Republicans were so successful in Florida seems to be the strength and their popularity among Latino voters. Anyway, I'll stop there. Looking forward to discussion.
So my analysis is more paying attention to the extremists and the conspiracy theorists last night. So while most were watching MSNBC, I was watching Stephen Crowder and Steve Bannon and playing on Telegram. And it was interesting, at the beginning of the night, there was this complete sense of a red wave. It was very articulate with them. There is a very vast overlap between religious and conspiracy theorists in these realms. And there was a lot of prayers being said that the demons would be taken away from the Democrats and the Republicans would rise up. But as the night sort of progressed, it started becoming more articulating violence and being upset and a sense of loss that was occurring. We did have Q put down a drop a week before the actual election, and it was a very interesting drop because unlike his other sort of posts that he put up that everyone can sort of interpret and understand, this one was very much an almost get out the vote kind of Q drop that came out. And so we had a lot of the conspiracy theorists last night trying to understand if this was the moment of the storm. Many of the conspiracy theorists actually believed that there was another takeover last night, that there was another cheating situation. And as Arizona became the focal point for this, we saw a lot of conspiracy theorists and extremists actually talking about how they want their representatives now to recount all the votes everywhere. We saw one of the things that changed among the groups that I research is normally it's very much culture war issue topics. So they talk about abortion, women's rights. They talk about how that affects their conspiracy theories that they believe in, like the Great Replacement or the Great Reset. And last night, and for the last couple of weeks, they haven't really been talking about that. The focus has been on more historical ideas of violence, crime in the streets, that there are problems with inflation, looking at gas prices, looking at more historical things rather than the culture war issues. For them, they had won with dogs, and God had blessed many of them in their position, and what was happening was America was making a change for the better, which really reinforced many of their conspiratorial ideas and their extremist ideas. And so last night there was a little bit of sadness, but there was also a change to the way they understood things. So the best way to explain that is we've all seen people talk about the end of the world is going to happen on X day, and then it doesn't happen. And then suddenly, they'll still believe there is like a mistake. There had to be a human-made reason why this moment at the end times of the rapture didn't occur. The same thing was happening last night. While they've been placing blame on the Democrats and the demons who run it and Q and the storm and everything that's happening, it really validated their position that they were the ones who were voiceless, the ones who were being attacked by the Democrats. And it really reinforced them to come back and keep fighting. They were sharing prayers last night, they were sharing, bullets instead of ballots, and really looking at, should this be a civil war, or should this be a moment to reflect and then come back out and fight? I felt that there.
Thank you. I was asked to talk about the international implications of the election, and my central argument is that regardless of the outcome, no matter how much the Democrats or Republicans advanced, it wouldn't fundamentally change U.S. foreign and defense policy. And given the results of last night, I'm more persuaded that this is the case. One could go back to Richard Nixon and post-Vietnam through various presidents, especially President Obama and President Trump. There has been a discussion about that the United States has been overcommitted and needs to exercise more restraint in the world. However, the world doesn't believe this, and continually the United States has been drawn into various disputes around the world, as it is now with regard to Ukraine. In some sense, it is, as Joseph Yoff put it, the United States is the West's default power. It's where the world goes when there's trouble for leadership. Another way of putting it is the United States is the Michael Corleone of international relations. Every time it tries to get out, they keep pulling it back in. And I think this is not fundamentally going to change. But I do feel that what could weaken America's position in the world as the most powerful nation, and it is, it has the most powerful military, its science and educational institutions are dominant, its popular culture, Big Macs, Coca-Cola dominate the world, Hollywood dominates international culture, everybody knows what the CIA does, everybody knows leaders in the United States beyond the president. The fact that we have such a large gathering here today indicates that, well, only Americans get to vote for Congress and the president. The constituency of the American government is global. And I think that this is part of its power. Yet we also know, as Samuel Huntington reminds us, that the United States government can be characterized as a promise of disharmony. It's made not to work smoothly. This disharmony and these endless contradictions and convolutions of U.S. politics was perhaps best captured 60 years ago, not by a political scientist, but by American novelist Alan Drury in his classic novel, Advising Consent, where he described the United States as that strange, fantastic, fascinating land in which there are few absolute wrongs or absolute rights, few all blacks or all whites, few dead certain positives that won't be changed tomorrow, the way it is today. A wonderful, mixed-up, bumbling, stumbling, hopeful land in which evil men do good things and good men do evil in a way of life and government so complex and delicately balanced that only Americans can understand it, and often they are baffled, as many are today. With regard to the future, Drury said America was about to learn whether history still had a place for a nation so strangely composed of great ideals and uneasy compromises. And this is the way I think people approach the United States. Is there a future for the United States? People have been saying this since 1776, but it seems to go on. But I do feel that the current disharmonies and bumbling, if they became too great, and there was this possibility, and evil men and women did evil things, and good men and women did not stop them, that this would undermine the ability of the U.S. to conduct an effective foreign and defense policy. It would weaken America's status in the world amongst its allies and tempt adversaries for further challenge. In this respect, what Abraham Lincoln said in 1838, I think still holds true today. At what point shall we expect an approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step over the ocean and crush us at what blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte as a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring from amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. So my view is the election and the controversy did raise this specter of an internationally weakened United States, weakened from within, not from without. The results seem to have postponed that, but that it's something that was that had been looming in the last few years, and that would have the most profound effect on international relations. Americans are held to the standards they set to themselves. No other great power. Nobody says, well, Russia's not living up to our expectations, or the Chinese aren't acting as properly as they should. But they say that about the United States. And once that is undermined, I think America's authority and its ability to marshal its resources will be undermined. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of the panel, I wanted to thank you all for your insights. And I promised some really thoughtful insights, and I think we got it. And what we've heard was a real mixed bag. I mean, in some cases, we've heard that 'twas ever thus. So Professor Sokolosky saying, regardless of the outcome, there are some intractable and immovable forces that still remain. We have others on the panel saying that there's this new rise of political violence, and that this might perhaps potentially suggest something in the future. We have P.J. Gardner talking about the way in which we think about elections through legacy pollsters and push polling, or pollsters that have a partisan agenda. So there's a lot there to digest. But let me just open up the discussion with it. One question that I didn't hear any of the panelists talk about, and that is, if you were watching any of the major networks last night, you would have heard the announcers talk about how they count ballots. And as we know, in the states, each state counts ballots slightly differently. But we also know that there was a significant advanced turnout in many states. And that there's a partisan divide between those who vote early, or those who vote by mail, generally Democrats, and those who vote on election day, more Republicans. And that may affect the results. And indeed, the counting of those ballots are part of the reason why we don't have results from many states or jurisdictions. So I guess my question to the panel is, do you have any insight into whether this is a temporary blip as a COVID phenomenon, or whether this suggests a new way of thinking about how voters cast their ballots, and what that means for the partisan divide, and what that means for fueling election deniers? Anyone?
Sure. So I think one thing that we can note about this is that the vote counting is happening at sort of a better pace in 2022 than it did in 2020, right? So if you're mentioning sort of issues around COVID and sort of the newness of mail-in voting, right, that is an issue. And it seems to be one that's been overcome to some degree. In a couple of states, like Pennsylvania, Georgia, there are probably some others, there were new laws passed that allowed mail-in ballots not to be counted in advance, but to be processed in advance, taken out of their envelopes, flattened, be ready for machine counting. You'll recall that Pennsylvania was one of the states that moved very slowly in 2020, and it looks quite a bit better this time, right? We have pretty much complete results out of Pennsylvania. The results are not quite as close, right? So that has some effects. But we are seeing that there is a desire to correct some of these vote counting issues, right? And I don't think we should be completely dismissive of the idea that vote counting sort of at a reasonable pace does contribute to people's confidence in elections, and that people do have some legitimate concerns about sort of how elections are counted. So improving those sorts of things is a good process, right? This is something that's positive, and it's one of the reasons to make sure that people who are committed to high-quality election administration continue to get elected. In places like Arizona and Nevada, right, which are having slow counting right now, one of the reasons for that is not actually sort of the issues with processing, and California is another one that moves relatively slowly, but a decision that's being made to expand access, right, so that people are allowed to vote and return their mail-in ballots up until election day, right, so that they can gather that information, they have time in order to get those ballots back. And what that means is that you have to wait for the mail to come in, right? If you have until election day to drop it in the mailbox, then it takes a while for those to come back. And in those places, we tend to see a little bit more use of mail-in ballots, right? California and Arizona are both nearly universal. California is totally universal mail-in ballots. And what that means is that you don't see as many of these sort of red shifts or blue shifts that you may have heard people talk about on CNN or MSNBC last night. All of these things sort of can have some effects on the confidence of elections, but the key thing to think about, I think, is to engage in voter education about why these things are happening, but also to recognize that sometimes when we do things that try to expand access and improve democracy that can slow down the vote counting, a lot of the reason for the historical expectation that votes should be counted quickly is because people were limited in ways they could vote. They had fewer opportunities to vote, and they generally could only vote on election day at a specific polling location. Now with more opportunities, that should be better for democracy, but it might mean some delay in that vote counting.
I just want to add on to that. Thank you, Paul. I think too, like, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that this like appetite for near instantaneous results is driven in part by like over time news outlets and this sort of horse race approach to politics, and then it's become an expectation that results come fast among voters and candidates and their campaign teams and so on. So I would really like fully agree with what Paul's saying. The other thing too is like, to me, you know, like last night looking at Twitter and so on as I was watching the news, I saw so many tweets of people going, look at these lines, people are so committed to voting, like just like love the enthusiasm. I'm like, that's not commitment, that's voter suppression. Like, so the physical infrastructure for in-person voting in the United States and many other jurisdictions around the world, including our own, is inadequate. So of course people want to seize on things like mail-in voting, which makes the act of voting more convenient. And I mean, looking to like the voter turnout literature, it has focused so much on decreasing the so-called costs of voting, basically making voting easier, that the move to things like mail-in balloting or online voting, as we have in Ontario with municipal elections across, we think, most jurisdictions, I mean, is a natural step. So it's really unfortunate that this is creating tension with electoral integrity and providing opportunities for, I mean, honestly, malicious actors to exploit a perfectly democratic process for partisan gain.
Yeah. So for the groups that I study, this is really a hot point topic for them. So many of the groups that I follow were actually telling their friends and groups to go vote day of, so that way there couldn't be a change to their ballot. So there's this conception that when you put it in, you know, much like on The Simpsons, you know, when you slide it in, it just switches it over to the other side. They're absolutely convinced of that. So they want to be there in person and actually see it. They want to do it day of, because what they saw in the 2020 election, where the numbers went up overnight, they are convinced that this is like the 2,000 mule thing. This morning there was a lot of conversation about it being the 4,000 mule movie coming out next because of what happened in Arizona. We could see their concern with the armed people who were patrolling in Arizona at the ballot boxes. There were a lot of complaints from individuals about being harassed when they were trying to drop off their ballots. People fully armed, their faces covered in camo, confronting people because they're convinced that these ballots are fake. Now, this isn't something that's just sort of happening on the underground in social media. Last night, Tucker Carlson was actually, you know, even though Fox is being sued by Dominion ballots, he was actually saying these votes are being changed in Arizona. We're having reports of this. And Arizona is sort of their ground zero of how they understand that this takeover and this falsification of ballots is happening. So it's really a trigger point for them with these changes of progress. And that validates their position that they're being disenfranchised and silenced, and their vote doesn't really count, which in some cases is leading people to violent outbursts or leaving offline groups and moving into offline action. So this change to ballots, although very good for democracy, really, really hurts this group of individuals who are the base for individuals like DeSantis and Trump.
Well, I think American elections have, as elsewhere, gotten a little better. It's after all, it used to be people were following Mayor Daley's advice to vote early and often, the ballot stuffing around the time of the President Kennedy's election in 1960 is the stuff of lore. Now it prompted the president's father to say he was willing to pay for a victory, but not a landslide. So I think these things have happened, but it is one of these things because the United States has been put on a list where it's moved down in terms of its democratic bona fides, and foreigners, others will jump right away and say, see, you're not that democratic, you've got the Carter Center running out, supervising our elections, why don't you guys stay home and supervise your own? So it fuels that notion that some people enjoy, burst forward and say you're not as good as you say you are, others in sorrow, but the election problems are amongst those things that help tarnish America's credibility abroad, but even amongst people who would like to see the United States fail for their own reasons. And this is why it's important.
Can I just want to push you a little bit on this, because one of the things you said really clearly was, you had this great quote by Samuel Huntington saying that the United States was built on the promise of disharmony, suggesting that these contradictions and conflicts were built into the system, as you said. Are the issues that we're seeing about the divisions the stuff of what we've always had, or is there something substantially different about it this time? Because in your comments, one of the conclusions I drew was that this has always happened and it's happening now. So you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's always happened. I think it's always happened, but it's been accelerated by social media. That's what I think makes it. It's instantaneous. Right. It's around the world. Somebody in a voter waiting to vote in Wichita, Kansas, talks to a foreign reporter, and suddenly it's all over the world. Something's wrong. And I think that to me is the difference. Huntington's the book, The Promise of Disharmony, talked about the inherent, what he called the IV gap, the interest versus ideals gap, that America would always fall short of its ideals. And for some people, this was proof that America was a lie. For Huntington, he would say it was not a lie, it's a disappointment, but it's only a disappointment because it's also a hope. Right. And that, I think, once we start seeing it as a lie and not as a hope. And you've heard the phrase that Americans use, to a more perfect union. And you think back of elections before when you were trying to hold elections in the South, where the Ku Klux Klan was, compared to the people showing up in camo outfits today, having the Klan stop African Americans from voting and others, to me seems a lot more serious. When you think about voting in the Jim Crow South, it's more serious. But because I think we all thought that so much progress had been made, these things that came about, it's really inspired by the Trump administration and the president himself, sort of took people aback and saying, maybe we didn't make that much progress. Maybe we're still here. Maybe, the promise of disharmony has gotten to the promise of anti-democracy. But it is, in its checks and balances and in all these things, a certain promise of disharmony, which, by the way, makes American politics amongst the most interesting in the world.
Right. Hence, all of us here. Yes. So I've got lots more questions, but I did promise I would turn it over to the floor. So allow me to invite you to ask questions of the panel, and I'll ask you to just state your name and speak loud. Actually, maybe I'll just grab that microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm Harry. I'm a second-year student. I had a question about a phenomenon and something that I saw being reported a lot on CNN where I was watching, called split ticket voting, which is where, you know, for like the Senate race you would see, you know, blue candidate winning, whereas in the governor race you would see red. I wanted to ask what kind of implications that might have for the future of the U.S. because there used to be at least a belief that there was such a huge partisan kind of loyalty, but now with this phenomenon that we're seeing in like I think New Hampshire, I think Vermont, and many other key states. Just wanted to ask what your thoughts on that were.
Great, great question. Split ticket voting.
Paul and I were talking about this at the beginning. You go.
Yeah, we were actually, and the comment that I had made to Elizabeth just before we started was that I was surprised at sort of the ahistorical nature because I had heard the same sort of comments about ticket splitting. Ticket splitting was actually a unique feature of American democracy that happened a lot as recently as 20 years ago, right? So people always asked about, people who studied comparative politics would always ask about American politics, like, why is there so little difference between your two major parties, right? They seem to sort of be quite similar, and that led to a lot of people making decisions about candidates based on sort of valence issues, based on trust, based on individual sort of brands within states. Right? State parties in the past were also not always totally aligned with the national party. And we're seeing some of those same things happen again, right? There are lots of voters that seem to be willing to check the box for a more sort of traditional type Republican candidate who don't want to check the box for some of these Trump-endorsed candidates, right? They may be they may be affected by some of this discussion that Democrats have been putting out about sort of protection of democracy and these elections being sort of a way to protect democracy. It also has to do with the quality of candidates that you're running in some places, right? Someone like Phil Scott or John Sununu are simply very popular, high-quality candidates in areas, right? Those are both Republican governors who won last night who were sort of operating in very democratic states. So what we're seeing, right, is that there's still a lot of strength of polarization. I think one of the reasons, possibly, why we're seeing not as big of a wave as we're used to is the entrenchment of some of this polarization, right? That you're less likely to see Democrats lose large amounts when it seems like there's sort of entrenchment of parties within individual districts. But on the other hand, if parties don't run high-quality candidates and don't run candidates that seem to match the districts or the states in which they're running, that's going to be problematic.
I just want to add on to that too. I mean, I also found it curious that some of the news I was following or the pundits were, you know, talking about this like it was something new or like sort of novel that, you know, they were sort of just noticing. And I mean, the whole ethos of it is sort of baked into American political culture too, and institutional design, right? So it fits very well with the idea of like checks and balances, and that we need to create curbs on the unfettered power of political elites and so on. And so voters do that sometimes in their own ways, and sometimes it's for other reasons, as Paul was describing. And some of the stuff I've seen in the literature too points to other candidate features that may sort of drive it. So like, you know, like gender or race affinity, right? So if the Republicans are running like, you know, a black candidate for a Senate race, like that candidate will draw a disproportionate share of black votes compared to a white candidate, or you know, same for some women candidates as well. So there can be all sorts of explanations for this. I would just add on too, as a Canadianist as well, that this kind of behavior, while splitting tickets is not generally possible in Canada because we don't tend to have multiple contests on a single ticket or a single ballot. That kind of behavior does happen here too, right? So the idea that voters will vote for a different party at the federal and provincial level, and if you actually look at data on control of government at the federal and provincial levels, in some provinces this pattern bears out quite remarkably. So Ontario is one of them. You will rarely see the same party in power in Ontario federally or provincially as federally, and it seems to switch like pretty soon after you would see like a federal change in office and so on. So I think it's a feature too of voters that can be quite general in an effort to sort of create variation in policy, but also to, you know, ensure accountability of policy making, or try to anyway.
I actually had the opposite for this. So one of the things of the conspiracies that was going around and floating online last night was that at some of the polling places they had the straight ballot where you could vote completely Democrat or completely Republican. And they were saying that this was a push to actually, you know, falsify the thing and the ballot and what actually won. So I think in a lot of ways, because people were sending that to like Jake Tapper, and they were sending it to these people on there and asking for responses. In some way, I think it was a response to what was happening online, because there were so many questions and so many pictures of straight ballot votes being posted last week.
Well, this may have related to you, but one of the things that's phenomenal in the United States is that you have just two political parties. And within those parties, you have a range of views on different things. Maybe logically, some of the old guy here, so I can quote like a crazy uncle. You know, the American comedian Will Rogers said he wasn't a member of any organized political party. He was a Democrat. Because at the time, the Democrats were based on Northern liberals and Southern segregationists. So, you know, it is a phenomenon which is, I think, somewhat unique to the United States, that if you are of the left or moderate, you can find what you want in your political party. And if you don't, you can vote in another political party. And so the American government would be different if it had a third party, which it hasn't had. You can imagine how different the government would end up being.
Thanks, Jonathan. Excellent comments. I've really enjoyed this. I want to pull you a little bit forward out of the election results and say, what are the implications? Because what I'm picking up, and your answers to the last question especially heighten this, is that perhaps the voters are doing what they've done in Canada with respect to Quebec and separation. They've looked at how extreme things got, and they're now pushing both parties back to the center. And I'm wondering if when we look at the Democratic Party, we could see a real opportunity here now for them to reach out to help some of the people who have supported the Republicans because of their economic situations, the transformation of the economy. And if the Democratic Party can reach those people now, they can help pull the United States towards the center instead of taking the route that some people predicted in recent books, that they're going to, you know, be leading the United States to irreconcilable differences on that. And then just as a quick follow-up to Elizabeth, what you said about the women supporters that are drawn to the Republicans, is there any correlation between that and the fact that a lot of the main supporters who are vaccine hesitant as opposed to anti-vaccine are also suburban white women in that? And then for Paul, pulling out of this, 3 states put in constitutional protections for abortion. And I'm wondering, could that have an impact on legitimacy in the Supreme Court? You know, and how the Supreme Court looks in light of that?
Okay, great, thanks very much. So there's several questions there. One is around this, the moving parties to the center. The second one is around the COVID effect, what I'm calling, and the third one is around the constitutional protection for abortion and the impacts of that. So.
I can start. Moving parties to the center, maybe, but I mean, the U.S. public actually. So party polarization isn't sort of a new phenomenon. It's been a sort of steady push for the last few decades, and it's been asymmetrical, right? It's much more among Republicans than Democrats, who have moved more right than the Democrats have moved left. The Democrats haven't actually, I mean, according to a lot of data, the Democrats haven't actually moved. And a lot of it is elite driven, right? So it's not necessarily, I mean, it's more complicated than I'm portraying it, but it's not necessarily that elites were responding to some big cultural shifts in the United States. It's actually more the reverse, that elites were, the polarization that's occurred is sort of the result of elite ideological movement and rhetoric. So with all that said, and again, it's an oversimplification, I would say actually that the US public is generally more moderate than it seems looking at its politics, right? So the US public is clearly in majority favor of reproductive freedom. The US public, I mean, there's regional variation, of course, that I'm like glossing over. The US public is in favor of gun control. The US public is more in favor of redistribution than its politicians seem to be, or some of its politicians, right? So I guess I would just sort of like start with that by saying there's always been opportunity to bring the parties to the center. The parties are the ones who, or the Republicans especially, who have migrated to more extreme positions. Last night showed, especially the Democrats, but also the Republicans, the power of appealing to the Democrats' like traditional bases in some states, right? So like watching the results in Pennsylvania, for example, where Democrats won the governorship and then Fetterman won his Senate race over Trump-endorsed Mehmet Oz, showed how the white working class voters haven't abandoned the Democrats and can be like pulled back in. And sort of, like in the last couple of elections, there's been a lot of narrative around the movement of the white working class towards the Republicans. Well, that, there were some signs that that's not permanent or that can't be recovered. And so I guess that's a sort of rambly way of getting at your question. And there were other races too where, I'm highlighting Pennsylvania, where white working class voters or working class voters generally seem to, I guess, sort of rediscover the Democrats.
So the small thing that I would add is it increasingly feels like we're experiencing and living through a political realignment. And so it might be the case that so I'm a little bit resistant in trying to figure out what exactly it means to be extreme and what it means to be centrist, right? So our traditional ideas of what it means to be centrist might not be useful, and John Fetterman's the perfect example of this, who has relatively progressive positions in a lot of areas, but also reaches out to working class voters in sort of more traditional ways as well, right? It's an unusual combination of policies, and this might be the result of the fact that we're seeing a new alignment of voters, right? Increasingly white working class voters identifying with the Republican Party rather than the Democratic Party, right? Highly educated suburban voters more likely to align with the Democratic Party. And so one thing that we might want to do is sort of resist our traditional understandings of what left and right is, and look at sort of what combination of messaging is working, right?
I think that the base that Donald Trump and DeSantis are actually going for, there's an issue here where if we think back into the past with Goldwater in 1964, the John Birch Society and their conspiracy theories were very much attached to that president or to that nominee. And he said, I'm going to disavow the leader of the John Birch Society, but understood the power of the vote of the people who were in the John Birch Society, which were very much anti-communist, very much culture war issues, and very conspiratorial. Now, what we're seeing now, though, is with politicians both here in Canada and the United States, is that we have them speaking from the pulpit of being a powerful leader and articulating some of these conspiracy theories. We see them talking about it in their platforms, in their social media, and how they engage with that. And that really reinforces some of these ideas. Now, because of COVID, a lot of people were far more engaged in social media and some of these conspiracy theories, and sort of went down rabbit holes looking for answers that were attached to vaccines or were attached to conspiracy theories. Now, so what we're seeing is that, you know, when we think about QAnon, it's a super conspiracy theory. So it has a whole bunch of other conspiracy theories hierarchically engaged with it. So if we think someone who doesn't believe there's a moon landing would very rarely engage with somebody who thinks the world is vibrating at a certain level, and you know, those combinations wouldn't happen. But now they're very much happening. And for conspiracy theories to really take hold, what we see is that people need to distrust the institutions, right? So the government, the media, universities, academics. So that distrust isn't going to just evaporate, right? And so we can see that Donald Trump is really engaging in the QAnon conspiracy theory, playing their theme song, you know, promoting Tom MacDonald and his rap music and promoting these ideas. But, you know, amongst the conspiracy groups and the extremists, they refer to DeSantis as Daddy DeSantos. And they have this logo that is actually Make America Florida in 2024. So while DeSantis is not necessarily articulating a lot of the conspiracy theories, he's hinting to those ideas and really sort of pushing those buttons, but is focusing much more so on the culture war issues that are very important to these conspiracy theories. So looking at the Don't Say Gay bill, or, you know, we're going to make sure that universities are not the hotbed of inoculation of teaching people how to be liberals or how to be communists, which is something that also happened in the 1930s and 1940s, this idea. But it can take so much stronger hold now, not just because of social media, but because of radio. All day long, Dana Loesch, you know, Ben Shapiro, all of them are talking constantly and sharing these ideas. And then they go home and turn on Fox News, or they turn on Salty Cracker on YouTube. And all of these ideas are being reinforced, as well as their churches, right? So we see, instead of having religious people on television or online, you know, giving a sermon from behind the altar, they're now sitting at something that looks like a news desk, and they're dissecting the news and articulating it that way. So if you're a member of the NRA, Dana Loesch is going to be telling you something that really looks at the Second Amendment. Then you turn on your religious thing, and it's going to be talking about the same ideas and at the same nominees. And we can see these ideas being shared on Breitbart and all of the different, you know, conspiratorial news networks that are online. So it's a reinforced message that's not just going to evaporate. So I think what we really need to look at internationally, because on the online, the world is borderless, right? I mean, what's happening in QAnon, we see those flags here. We see the Confederate flags here at the convoy. We see, you know, Donald Trump won flags here. So it's borderless, and so our response has to be the same as well. Looking at transparency and how to rebuild some types of trust. And I don't know if that will move the moderate line, because if we ignore these individuals, it's going to be to our own detriment. You know, we ignored them in the 60s, we ignored them in the 70s, and you know, it keeps rising up and erupting again. So it's something that we need to take a hold of now, because it's international.
Go.
So, I just wanted to just come up to some of the foreign policy implications of this. And there, one of the things that's one finds in the American political cultures with Hofstadter, there was a certain anti-intellectualism, which is arose out of a need for equality. And in foreign policy, this has expressed itself in the last few years under a suspicion of the foreign policy elite, whether you call it the blob or the Washington playbook, whether it's Democratic or Republican. These are the people who believe the United States had to be engaged in the world and didn't see, never met a crisis they didn't want to intervene in as part of it. And it's both, for a while you find after Vietnam, the Democrats were saying, you know, we need to restrain ourselves. Then in the 1990s, when President Clinton was getting too involved in peacekeeping, it was the Republicans who called for restraint. So there was always this notion. What's interesting is that polling generally puts the American public where you think it would be. It's in the middle. It's not isolationist. It wants the United States to act abroad, but it wants it to lead. You know, since the Groucho Marx now, I never join a club which had someone like me as a member. The United States will never join an international organization or undertaking that wouldn't have it as the leader. So Americans do want, what they want, and what the polling shows is they want their leaders to make the case for the intervention. It's not automatic. They compel their leaders to go make a case, and sometimes you exaggerate. But even during the Trump period, the American public was largely in the center when it came to America's international road. I don't think the United States has ever been isolationist, but they were cautious, which is what you want the public to be when it comes to foreign policy. But I think just as on domestic politics, on foreign policy, there is that center which has been there, but which has somewhat been overwhelmed by both the Republicans and Democrats who have invaded against the foreign policy elite, the bloc. And a lot of these turned out to be no Trumpers on the Republican side. William Kristol, Elliott Cohen, people who had led the Republican liberal internationalists, went after Trump for his thing. And ironically, liberals were criticizing Trump for pulling back and abandoning America's role.
Emil,
Yeah.
and then in the background.
Thank you. So Emil, I'm a PhD student in the department. And so first I'd like to commend everyone, all the panelists, for being willing to talk about the election the day after. I think it takes courage when we don't really know what's happening in some states yet. My question, so we've been talking about winners and losers. So Professor Gardner highlighted a few winners and losers from last night. But one person we haven't been really talking about that I think is important is Joe Biden. So my question is a general question for everyone. What should be the lessons of last night for Joe Biden and the White House, especially moving toward 2024, when we can see that in many states, Democrats are popular in a way that Joe Biden isn't, and in other states, he is more popular than them. So how should you approach those results? And maybe to bring a more IR lens, I think Professor Sokolosky is absolutely right when he says that there isn't that much change that can be brought to U.S. foreign policy depending on which party is in power, but it can create some friction when there's a division between the House and the Senate, between the legislature and the executive. So I'm just wondering what you think will be the consequences of the midterms for some specific crises that are looming and coming in our direction. I'm thinking of Iran, the negotiation of the deal. When we look back at 2015, the fact that the Senate was Republican created friction over the Iran deal, and then it was abandoned by Trump. But also Taiwan, when we saw in the last few months that there's even tensions within the Democratic Party as to how to behave in relations to that looming crisis.
So, if we had seen a red wave last night, I think we'd be talking a lot more about Joe Biden and the Joe Biden agenda today. I think the reason, I think what the Biden administration is going to be taking away from some of the results that we saw last night is that what they've been doing is pretty okay, right? Especially given some of the challenges they're facing economically, right, coming in with COVID. I think they're going to see this as a relative approval of what they've done. One thing that we're seeing with low approval ratings is that this seems to be increasingly structural. I don't know that we're going to get to a point with American presidents under sort of the current structure of the regime that we have, right, without some sort of major changes in sort of the way that the parties are aligned or identification of voters with those parties. I don't think we're going to see 55, 60% approval ratings at midterm time again. And I think that the Biden administration was already probably cognizant of this fact. And so I think they're going to see these results as more or less an approval of what they're doing. We talked about some of the races in this election being particular to the candidates or the specific policy appeals of Fetterman. Was he a good candidate for this? I think all of this sort of leads us to the conclusion that Joe Biden was not the animating force in this election. So what does that mean for 2024? Well, you're not going to be able to have that sort of dodge, right? And rely on the personalities of other candidates. He will have to run on his accomplishments and his future agenda at that point in time, and we'll see something different. But then we also bring potentially Donald Trump back into the mix. I'm not as sort of optimistic as Elizabeth about sort of the ability of this election to take Donald Trump out of the mix. And so the question becomes, at that point, right, we have lots of variables that come in.
I said a path to a Trump victory is less certain. And don't count him out, because he seems sometimes to be like a phoenix that rises out of the ashes. He's like a cat with 9 lives, right? Just to very quickly add on to that too, I would say so I agree with all that, and I mean, just to add on a little bit about sort of measurement stuff. So what we see in like election studies, for example, in the last like 5 to 10 years is we often, in election studies anyway, measure leader or executive, the feelings about them on a 0 to 100 scale. And naturally partisans would place the executive, like same party partisans would place their executive much higher than opposite party partisans. What we've seen over time is a lowering of the measurement consistently for rival party executives. So whereas in the past, a Democrat or a Republican might have been willing to give Biden like, okay, 50%, like he's you know, the lights are still on, things seem to be moving fine. But now people are like, it's like 0, he's a Democrat, right? So I think, you know, this sort of is consistent with some of what you're saying too. Like the willingness to even recognize good traits or decent legislation or policy agenda on the part of your rivals has diminished over time. And so comparing current approval ratings of like Biden or before him Trump to historic averages is to some extent misleading too. The other thing I would say is if we're thinking about Biden, what Biden should be doing over the next couple of years is just letting the Republicans fight out whatever issue. It's like, you know, a dysfunctional family, right? Like, let them sort it all out. They're gonna rip each other to shreds potentially, and then we'll emerge the, you know, calm, cool, collected, we have an agenda, etc.
I think we have time for one more question. Did you
No, I
want
was
to respond
handed
to
him
this?
for the international relations question.
Sure.
I think we're all familiar with this quote. We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. That's Trump. Here's another one. There is no longer a bright line between foreign and domestic policy. Every action we take in our conduct abroad must be taken with American working families in mind. Advancing a foreign policy for the middle class demands urgent focus on our domestic economic renewal. Who said that? Joe Biden. So, in fact, what I'm saying is you were in a position already in which Americans were trying to focus after the years of the wars. And I think that's true. On foreign economic policy, the president was pretty protectionist. Someone wrote that Biden may not be doing American first, but his policy is America first. And I think this applies to foreign economic policy. You can see his direction, billions and billions of dollars into reducing dependency on certain things. He's keeping the existing trade agreement, but it's clear that he wants to restore American manufacturing. With regard to the other point, you know, it was always said that partisanship ends at the water's edge. That was never true. Foreign policy was always a partisan issue. I mean, people thought about it all the time. And you saw it with regard to the Iran deal. But remember, that's not a treaty. And so it did not need Senate ratification. So you could say whatever you wanted in the Senate. You could bring a foreign leader, Benjamin Netanyahu, to speak before the U.S. Senate against an American president. I mean, it's exactly the sort of thing George Washington warned about foreigners taking advantage of American factionalism. But until the Senate has to make a decision in voting on a treaty, there's a certain carelessness involved, and I think that you will have that. And on the Iran, whether they'll negotiate, but now with Iran clearly supporting supplying weapons to Russia, Biden's going to have a hard time getting that, because the argument against that treaty was, oh yeah, you can have certain pledges for atomic weapons, but you won't stop their bad behavior, and here's an example of it, and you can't sign with these people. And so I think you're going to get, with the Republicans in charge, if they get one house or the other, you're going to have investigations. Just as you had this investigation over Benghazi. And where did it go? It went nowhere. But it generated a lot of attention, but it went nowhere. So I think you will find a little more activity on foreign policy issues, but not a lot of impact on foreign policy, because the United States, as powerful it is, doesn't get to decide how the rest of the world acts. And certainly not the Congress. And there's still a broad internationalism that's involved. Certainly with regard to China, Republicans aren't any slouch. And certainly with regard to military spending, you can see the budget, which is always pushed up anyway by Democrats and Republicans, may go even further.
So, sorry. We've got time for one last question, so I'll ask you to keep it brief, and I'll ask our panelists to respond quickly as well.
Thank you, sir. So first I'd like to take the time to thank the 4 panelists for giving us their voices today, and thank you, Professor Rose, for moderating this event. My name is Sullivan Pearson. I'm a first-year political science student. So Professor, you talked a little bit about how Democrats have been bolstered by Generation Z voters in this midterm election. And I was wondering what you thought about the implications of the first Generation Z candidate being elected to the House of Representatives in Florida, FL10, I believe,
yep.
And also what you thought about how maybe Democrats would field more candidates in the future because of their recent successes in this age group. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that candidate, the first Gen Zer to enter Congress, and I thought, oh my God, I'm old. This is a real opportunity too to have a voice for young people's issues, and the issue agenda that a lot of Gen Zers emphasize is a bit different than that of older voters, especially in relation to economic opportunity, housing, gun control, reproductive freedom, as well as protection for marginalized groups like LGBTQ+. I also noticed too, this candidate is swimming in a sea of red, and I was like, okay, there are still some blue spots in Florida. If we want to know what kind of impact too that this new congressperson can have too, AOC is a special kind of congressperson, I think, but look at how she has been able to connect with voters through social media and create such a platform for herself. And I think, because such Congress people are relatively rare, and because they do have not just the knowledge of how to use tools to connect with voters, but they do it in a way that is authentic and genuine and natural. Unlike a lot of the sort of middle-aged and older politicians who are, God love them, attempting to use these tools, but it just never seems right. And so, anyway, that's my, not maybe so short answer, but I think someone to watch for sure. And I'm really excited that there is another sort of quite young voice in Congress. You're good?
Well, actually, that's perfect timing because we are out of time. And on behalf of everyone here, I wanted to extend my thanks to the panel. As Emil mentioned, it takes a certain kind of academic to be able to have some observations, and thoughtful ones at that, the day after the election. So I wanted to thank all of you for your insightful comments and all of you for your questions. Please join me in thanking you.